right. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for joining us over Facebook Live and here in our Zoom room. Welcome to our virtual tour of the Timken. I'm so excited to have our two docents with us today, Jerry and Barbara, to be presenting on educating, exciting, and experience art, which is so fun. So just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. Please keep yourselves muted throughout our presentation. If you do have any questions, please feel free to add them to the chat and we'd be happy to address those at the end. If you're joining us over Facebook Live, you can also use the comment section there in order to add your question, and we'll be monitoring that and we can answer those questions as well. Lastly, these presentations are being recorded and they will be posted on our Facebook as well as our YouTube channel. So if you would like to go back and watch those, you can do that as well on our social media and our YouTube and Facebook. So please feel free to do that. Otherwise, though, I'm so happy again to introduce our docents, Jerry and Barbara, today, and they can go ahead and get this started.
Thank you, Samantha. Good morning. I am Jerry Veal. Barbara Morgan and I welcome you to our exploration of 3 centuries of art. The executive director of the Timken Museum, Megan Pogue, asked us to focus on the 3 E's: education, excite, and experience of art. Barbara and I hope to share our learning and our excitement about the Timken collection during our discussion with you about 3 centuries of art, the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. Each century has its own particular style, and each picture will exemplify that style. You will see the change artists bring to their art through their travel, association with other artists, and the location in which they are painting. We begin in the 16th century, when religious paintings are the main focus of painterly efforts due to the Catholic Church being the primary patron of artists and having the biggest purse. Monarchs and other wealthy nobles are also employing artists to paint devotional works and some portraits, but the Catholic Church really has the largest purse and generates the main interest in art. However, at the beginning of this century, a momentous event occurs. The Protestant Reformation has begun, turning the public's interest from Catholicism to the less ostentation and less flamboyant Protestantism. In response, the Catholic Council of Trent in 1563 produced a written strategy to stem the loss of their worshipers. The council stated that visual arts should be devoted to narrative clarity, meaning the church's parables and teachings should engage the viewer emotionally and delight the sense to inspire devotion. Thus directed, Rome and the church's purse, together with competition from the Protestant adherents, spurred a boom in the artistic endeavors. Here we have our first work of art today. It's called The Virgin of Sorrows with Donors, a painting done in 1564, 457 years ago, by a Flemish artist, Peter Claessens the Elder. The painting was done on wood panel with oil in triptych form, meaning a central picture with 2 side wings attached on either side, mostly intended, this one particularly intended as a family devotional piece. It's about 28 inches tall, so it's the perfect size to sit on a shelf or a small altar, and the wing panels could be folded over to protect that central picture for the ease in travel and storage. This piece was possibly commissioned by the family pictured on the wings. Ironically, you will notice there are 7 family members, which might have directed the subject matter of the painting. As you can see, this is a very striking picture of the Virgin Mary as the central figure seated in a very small, very plain room, surrounded by swords pointing at her head in halo form. This is why I personally call this picture the Madonna of the Migraines. It seems like it makes sense to me, but seriously, this is a picture that signifies the 7 sorrows of Mary. Now, what are those sorrows? Those sorrows are briefly paraphrased as number one, the prophecy of Simeon. Simeon meets Mary and Joseph and the child Jesus in the temple. He says to Mary that the child will be the ruin and the resurrection of many, and there will be a sword through Mary's heart. The second sorrow is the flight into Egypt. Herod tries to find and destroy that child. Mary and Joseph flee to Egypt and stay until Herod is dead. The third, the loss of the child in Jerusalem. Mary and Joseph return to Jerusalem for a visit, and they leave on a caravan. A day later, they discover that Jesus isn't with them. He's 12 years old at this point, and they are frantic. They return to Jerusalem and find him in the temple. Sorrow number four, Mary meets Jesus on the way to Calvary. A heart-rending meeting. He's being forced to carry his cross, blood-stained. He's being taunted by the crowds. Think about how difficult that would be. The fifth sorrow, Jesus dies on the cross. Mary is at his feet, her heart pierced with sorrow, thus fulfilling the first prophecy. The sixth sorrow, Mary holds his body. Pilate has released his body to Mary. She's holding him at the foot of the cross. The seventh sorrow, Jesus is laid in the tomb. Mary is there to see his body washed and bandaged and laid to rest with the stone closing the door of the tomb. Now, the intent of this piece is that the faithful look at Mary and meditate on each of these sorrows deeply. In doing so, they gain grace and mercy from Mary and from God. This is meant to reinforce your belief in the religion, and this family devotional piece is meant to show that these people are very devoted to Catholicism. Now, you'll notice that the dress for the era is for this particular picture, is very plain. Each of the family members are dressed almost all in black. The men and the mother have little white ruffs and white collars. The two girls have just a touch of gold at their necks. That seems a little unusual for the middle of the Renaissance. But remember, this artist is in Flanders. He's in Bruges, Flanders at the time. And Flanders is governed by Philip II of Spain. Now, Spain is well known for its very austere and very severe form of Catholicism. In addition, Flanders is a hotbed of the Protestant movement, which dislikes flamboyance and excess in any form. So all of these opinions were causing the family that requested this devotional piece for it to be somber and appropriately religious and devotional. However, you'll notice that the artist let his imagination flow. If you look at the top quarter of the two wing pieces, you'll see a wonderful kind of mystical landscape with mountains and castles and foliage. This shows the artist letting loose of his artistic tendencies a little bit. Now, did this represent the family's home in Spain? Perhaps. We know that Spain has mountains, even Alps, but the Netherlands, of course, complete flatlands. So this is either a flight of fancy on the artist's behalf or perhaps a request by the donor family to have it represent their homeland. Now, there are a coat of arms behind each wing, and the archivists in Berlin and Belgium are searching archives trying to identify this family. But unfortunately, we don't know who it is yet. We're just left to enjoy and appreciate the artistic ability of this piece. It's really quite exceptional. And 457 years in age, it's amazing that it's lasted this long. Now, the story of this painting coming to San Diego is quite thrilling. It's quite the detective story. The owner family that owns this particular piece discovered just the central piece, the portrait of Mary, at an auction in 1982. They were very taken by the piece, had no idea that there was anything else to it. and purchased the piece basically on its own merits. But in 2015, an associate curator of the Timken happened to see a picture of the entire piece in an auction catalog from Amsterdam. He quickly contacted the San Diego owners and said, "Look at this. These must belong to your piece." They contacted the auction house in Amsterdam, and after appropriate investigation and negotiation, they were successful bidders for the two wings, which were then transferred to San Diego, and all three pieces were sent to the Balboa Art Conservation Center and were restored together. Then the owners were kind enough to loan this piece in total to the Timken for display to the general public so that we can all enjoy it. It's a great detective story about this piece of art that happens. Now let's look at the next slide, please, Samantha. This is Peter Claessens, known as the Elder. And why was he known as the Elder? Because he had 5 sons. 3 of those sons were also artists, one of whom was also named Peter. So that necessitated the designation Peter Claessens, the Elder and the Younger. Now, in the early 1500s, very few paintings were signed. So it's difficult to figure out which paintings Peter Claessens created and which his sons created. In addition to that, there was a family workshop. Everybody worked in the same place. It wouldn't have been unusual for the Elder to have painted the main picture and the sons to have filled in some of the other minor details, perhaps the room that Mary's sitting in, who knows, something like that. However, a great deal of research has been done and investigation using today's technical techniques, X-ray, infrared, all of that sort of thing. And various experts across the US now agree that this particular painting was more than likely done by Peter Claessens, the Elder, which is really interesting. Now, we have learned a little bit about what is happening in Northern Europe in the early 16th century and the power of public opinion and the power of art has on public opinion. Barbara is now going to lead us into the 17th century and another exquisite example of this power.
Thank you, Jerry. I like the term that Jerry used at the onset when she was giving her introduction, and she was talking about the 3 centuries of which art it will be depictive of today. And when she was mentioning the beginning, the 16th century, and the Reformation that had occurred and then followed by the Counter-Reformation, she made the term visible to us when she said it spurred a boom in artistic endeavors. And that is so true. So that boom in artistic endeavors continued, and among the artists who pursued that was Giovanni Francesco Barbieri, but he was known by El Guercino, his nickname, and El Guercino, or just Guercino, is what he is always known as. Now, as we can see, and many of you are very familiar with this painting, The Return of the Prodigal Son. And this Return of the Prodigal Son, because of its themes, is very, very often depicted, not only in art, but also in literature. And it's depicted because of its themes. Its themes encompass repentance, forgiveness, and salvation. And as we already know, but I'll quickly review, the story tells of the younger son who squanders his share of the family's estate and returns home to beg his father's forgiveness. Now, our Timken painting that we see on the screen now depicts the very moment when the penitent son returns home and is joyfully received by his father. Guercino demonstrates the father's heart, the father's compassion and forgiveness for his son. What we see here is he is wrapping his cloak, which is around the shoulders of his son. The other aspect right in the middle shows the interlocking of their hands and their lower arms. This part of it is called the emotional center of the painting because of the themes that I previously mentioned. Now, the other aspect here that helps illuminate ideas between these characters are, first of all, let's look at the father. The father is dressed in vibrant red with patches of blue, but we also see the patch of blue above the sun of the sky. These colors enrich the theme, and especially the theme of salvation. Now, the father is attired in Turkish dress, and that Turkish dress evokes ancient times. And that's done for effect to show the contrast between the father and the son returning home. Now, I have found in the research that when this painting was completed and people viewed it, they were perplexed by the Turkish dress of the father. It seemed quite exotic to them and they did not quite understand. I think as we interpret it beyond that point, we understand it perhaps more than some of the viewers who we heard in a previous presentation did not know how to read. So what you saw was what they got, and that would be true here. Now, I already mentioned the word contrast. Just we look at the son, obviously, he is shown dressed in rags. He's weeping and he's looking away in sorrow. His gaze is averted in shame and to what he did and hoping certainly for the forgiveness. To the left of the painting, when we first heard about this painting, when we were in training to be docents, we had a couple of members who thought, is that the other son? But it is not the other son. That is a servant who, at the behest of the father, is helping him grab some new clothing for the son. But what is very important in that is he's moving away that drapery, and as he's dispatching that clothing, and that drapery is simultaneously letting us in, the viewer, into the whole scene. Now, the other interesting aspect as we look at the servant, as the servant is dressed in the contemporary attire of that day in the 1600s, the 17th century. So perhaps the people who viewed it could really relate to what was being done to enhance his boss, the father, and then what the father was doing for the son. As Jerry mentioned in her introduction, this painting, which was commissioned by the Catholic Church, is done in the post-Reformation era, which of course is called the Counter-Reformation. It's conducive of Baroque art. And as many of us already know, Baroque art was very dramatic. It was a contrast of dark and light, a contrast of emotions with these vivid colors and light and dark that I already mentioned. Looking back at this painting, we already know that some of the vivid coloring was done for effect, certainly as it enhances the father and the blue sky above the sun. All of that contributes to the meaning of the theme of forgiveness and salvation. During this time, which is 1654, that Guercino painted this composition in Italy, the Catholic Church, as now very much a part of the Counter-Reformation, was using this art to help bring back people to the church. Now, Samantha, if you would move to the next slide, please. It's I've had us look just at the sun here, and from Luke, chapter 15, verses 11 through 32, these are only two of the lines of those verses. For this son of mine was dead and has come back to life. He was lost and is found. I wonder, since these paintings, these Baroque paintings, were inadvertently used by the Catholic Church to hope to bring back people who protested and they wanted them back in the fold of Catholicism, if we couldn't paraphrase this and say, for this church of mine was dead and has come back to life. She was lost and is found. And as I mused that thought in my own mind, I thought, here we are hundreds of years later, and perhaps we're still saying, we as humans are lost and we need to be found. Perhaps the journey never truly ends in our lifetime. Now, as we look at this prodigal son that was commissioned at this time in 1654, 1655 by the Archbishop of Bologna, he, of course, commissioned our artist, Guercino. So if we move to the next screen, Samantha, here he is pictured. He is actually, I think it was Jerry who said to me, he looks austere, but there's a warmth about him too. He looks at us with meaning, and he is actually considered and ranked very highly among the old masters in the era of Baroque art. It was he who was born in Cento near Bologna in Rome, and he remained in Rome throughout his entire career. But being an artist who was mostly self-taught, he became one of the most distinguished Baroque artists of the 17th century and a leading figure of the art school of Bologna, which is, of course, very near his home. Now, in his early career, he obviously forged his own style of Baroque painting. And that style was a contrast between dark and light. But something else that I came across was that the dark that he showed, and Samantha, if you go back to the original painting for just a moment, the dark in the background and behind them, the meaning of his darkness means that it's obscuring something. And the light, just the opposite, it brings it forward. So his contrast of the dark and light is obviously meant for that reason. So now if we go back to his picture, 2 slides forward. Later in his career, he got sensitive. He didn't go there, but he got sensitive to the artistic fashion of Rome. And so he began to pursue a more classical style. And that classical style, he did something that I have never quite read about before. He combined his drawing and his intellect. And the only thing I could do to understand that is he didn't have a look at something and then later on draw it in isolation, but he was thinking as he drew. And so therefore his whole heart and soul must have gone into what he did. And maybe that's why this picture of the return of the prodigal son is emphatic in me, because of what this artist was thinking as he was drawing and then ultimately painting it. The other thing that he did here is he began to bring in the Venetian color. And the Venetian color he learned also from, he had never gone there, but he obviously maybe heard about it in Bologna, where he was involved in the Academy of the Arts. So all in all, Guercino is especially famed for his imaginative use of allegorical and religious themes. And this is so true here. Now, as we're going to continue in a moment, but I would like to piggyback on what Jerry said about artists of these 3 decades. And the art of this is the art, the next artist will be also an Italian painter, as Guercini is, but the next painter that Jerry will tell us about will have been doing his work mainly in Venice. And he is going to be the one, and some of you already know who I'm talking about, who pioneered the genre of cityscape Venice. And he became known as the father of 18th century Venetian view painting. So with that background, Jerry will now continue to educate and excite us about the experiences of our next artist. Jerry?
Thank you, Barbara. That was a great exploration of the prodigal son. That is such an emotional picture with such vibrant colors. And I think the portrait of Il Guercino really shows his soul. It's a great portrait with that beautiful linen collar. We're going to now move to the earlier portion of the century. And the early 1700s, the focus on religious art has now been diluted by the Reformation and the Protestant views. And the artists and the clientele are starting to become interested in seeing paintings of other things other than just portraits and religious art. One of those main focuses becomes landscapes, and to a lesser degree, cityscapes, all kind of the same type. In the early 18th century, the interest in Italy spread throughout Europe. The Grand Tour, the essentially gap year for young, wealthy Northern Europeans had become a custom. These young men were usually in their 20s, and they were eager to see new sights, new people, and to kick up their heels away, of course, from the disapproving view of their parents and the more severe conservative society. They've been to Paris, everybody's done Paris, and now Italy becomes more interesting. Venice, with its storied past and incredible views and intellectual stimulation, becomes one of the main focuses and a very appealing destination. Of course, as they travel, these young men through Europe and environs, they're picking up mementos, pieces of objects of art, statuary, keepsakes, and paintings, so that they can send them home before they go back, or even just carry them with them until they get home, so that they can show when they return their parents and their friends all these wonderful places they've seen and the wonders that they've seen. And paintings were perfect for that. They were typically on canvas, could be rolled up, therefore stored easily, and were more easily undamaged through the 2 or 3 years that the Grand Tour took. You know, a gap year today might actually be 6 to 8 months, but think about the difficulties of traveling across the Alps or around the ocean. There was no railroad or anything like that for these people to take. They were very physically traveling. And so their Grand Tour took 2 or 3 years. Now, here we have a classic scene of the Piazza di San Marco, St. Mark's Square. It looks very much like it would today, except for the clothing of the people that are in the square. This work is oil on canvas. It's a huge work. It's about 3 feet tall and 6 feet wide. So I encourage you, when the museum reopens, to go and see this canvas in person, because you'll more easily perhaps be able to pick out the detail. It's really exquisite and exciting. As I said, this is oil on canvas, done more in Venice than wood, because the dampness in Venice from the Adriatic Sea and all the canals made that wood warp. So it wasn't really suitable for pictures. Sailing, on the other hand, was ubiquitous. So there was plenty of canvas. So most of the paintings oil paintings in Venice were done on canvas. Now, this particular painting, as I mentioned, by Luca Carlavaras, is done from the viewpoint of the middle of the Grand Canal. You're perhaps on a Vaporetto or something else, and you're looking square down the Grand Canal. This is the Piazzetta, which is the entry plaza. And you will see that the buildings are the same as they are today. You've got the library and the clock tower on the left. You've got the Doge's Palace and St. Mark's Basilica on the right. And in the center, you have two columns. Now, on the left, the column is topped by St. Theodoric, who has a spear, and he is stabbing a dragon. If you look at the picture closely, that dragon today looks more like a crocodile, but at the time it was a dragon. On the right, the column is topped by the winged lion of St. Luke, which is also the identifier of Venice and the identifier of St. Luke. Now, these columns were a gift from a Constantine empire in the last half of the 12th century, a Byzantine emperor, excuse me, in the latter half of the 12th century, as a thank you for the Venetian army joining them for help in the Second Crusades. This Byzantine emperor actually sent 3 columns in thanks for this assistance. But when the columns were delivered and were being offloaded to the plaza, one of the columns rolled off the ship and sank and has never been recovered. Kind of ironic. Now, if you look at the picture directly between the columns, you will notice that there's nothing there. There's no people seated between the columns. There are no goods stacked or anything like that. The reason for this is that that used to be the spot for public executions. There was a guillotine there. And the inhabitants of Venice thereafter refused to walk between the 2 columns. Now, otherwise, this is a perfect selfie. You know, this is a perfect snapshot of Venice at the beginning of the 18th century, which was a very busy place. It is teeming with people. It's been reported that Napoleon referred to St. Mark's Square as the drawing room of Europe. The world met, traded, and played in Venice, a true East meets West place for the civilized world at large. The shadows in the picture indicate that this is late afternoon, and the empty baskets and boxes around indicate that this is probably Friday afternoon, which was the day of the fowl market, meaning birds, but the boxes and the cages are all empty. So it is, in fact, after the market is over, it's late afternoon. Most business is done, but if we go to the next slide, you'll see that you can tell the worldliness of the people. Actually, I think the original picture is a little easier. I thought this slide would be a little larger upon viewing, but not. Oh, that's what I was looking for. Thank you, Samantha. Notice the clothing, and notice everybody's just kind of laying around. They're sitting there chatting. They're maybe gambling a little. You've got somebody that's asleep on the quay. This means the market is done. They're just kind of shooting the breeze. But notice the clothing. You have clothing from all over the world here. You have people probably from Turkey, speaking of Turkey from the last art piece, with fezzes. You have merchants in black hats and brown suits. Let's go to the next slide too, Samantha. This is an example of the world meeting in Venice. Here on the left side of the plaza, you see we probably have English or perhaps Protestant gentlemen in the black suits with the square lace collars, shaking hands with perhaps a man from Constantinople, who knows? You have some judges in the back with their long wigs and long black robes, and showing Carlavaras's humor. There's 2 dogs at the base of that column. This is really a wonderful picture. Again, probably best seen in person, but we try here to show you the thrill and the adventure that is shown in this. Imagine a young man of 20-some arriving home and unrolling this picture to show his family and friends where he's been and the people he's seen, and how different the people of the world can be, and yet all engaging in conversation and business in a polite manner, theoretically. Now, let's go to the next slide. Luca Carlavaris was born in Udine, northeast of Venice, into a very creative family. That's quite the wig, isn't it? His father was a famous architect, and by the time he was 16, Luca had moved to Venice and had become part of the Guild of Painters, which was a key to becoming part of the art trade and being able to sell your pictures. He visited Rome in his early years and there studied with the Dutch painter Caspar van Wittel, who the Italians named Vanvitelli. Now, he was the originator of the genre of vedute, which is a cityscape or a scenic view of the city or countryside. Carlavaris really liked what Vanvitelli was doing. And when he went home to Venice, as Barbara mentioned, became the father of the Venetian vedute. He created over 100 etchings of the city, which are exact replications of the buildings of the city, and which are used even today by authors and researchers trying to replicate what's happening in the city at the time. Carlavaris was the top vedute painter in Venice. Everybody who was anybody had paintings by him at the time. Unfortunately, as so often happens, he was supplanted by a younger follower who studied with him. Anton Canal, known as Canaletto, has actually become even more famous than Carlavaris. A cruel truth. As we know, time waits for no man and marches on ruthlessly. The end of the 18th century was a time of great change to the English colonies, now known as the United States of America, to France, which was in the grips of the Great Revolution. You had the Industrial Revolution really starting to gain strength, and there was change everywhere you looked, very unsettling. Even now, painters were beginning to emerge from the young United States, even though they still looked to Europe for inspiration and for ideas. And Barbara is going to tell us about one of the most successful of those painters and the picture that exemplifies the time. Barbara?
Thank you, Jerry. I love Jerry's comment. Painters were beginning to emerge from America, even though they still looked to the old world for inspiration. And one such painter, as Jerry mentioned, is Benjamin West. And he painted Fidelia and Speranza in 1776, which is, of course, a very famous date here in our country still. Now, in 1760, previous to 1776, Benjamin West, who had been born in Pennsylvania, left Pennsylvania to study abroad. And from 1760 until 1763, he did that in Rome, Italy. But in 1763, he went to London, England, where he stayed the rest of his life. And he acquired international success and a great reputation for his neoclassical style. And he always presented historical and literary subjects in his paintings. Now, let's backtrack and remind ourselves, what is neoclassicism? Well, that means classicism anew. So there's an emphasis here on linear design to depict classical themes. Also, there's always an aesthetic attitude based on Greece and Rome, which often evokes harmony, restraint, statelessness, idealism, and I suppose we can name other aspects too. Now, his subjects were historical and literary. And obviously, in this case, they're literary because these two figures, Fidelia and Speranza, come from the long epic poem called The Faerie Queene. And The Faerie Queene was written by Edmund Spenser, and it's very long. It's about 6 books long. And I was reading something on it recently that said, if any of us were to sit down now at a reading level that is written at, we would read continually to read all 6 books for 19 hours and 14 minutes. I don't know who deciphered that. Maybe they had somebody actually do it, but I had to kind of chuckle. But this particular painting comes from book 1. And book 1, I'm going to give you just a little brief overview of book 1, so then we can zero in on where these two characters come from in that storyline. Book 1 of this, first of all, the book itself is, the purpose is to give tribute to the queen at the time, Elizabeth I, and to the Tudor dynasty. So the name Faerie Queene is depictive of Queen Elizabeth. And this book 1 is about the legend of the Knight of Cross. And the Knight of Red Cross is really Saint Gregory. And we have often heard of Saint Gregory supposedly killing the dragon. Well, that is depicted here in book 1 with the Knight of the Red Cross. He's on a quest, and the quest in book 1 is to be led by his beloved, who represents truth. And he is to follow her to get rid of all of his evils to the house of holiness. And this house of holiness is inhabited by Dame Celia. And Dame Celia is the mother of these 2 girls, plus a 3rd girl whose name is Clarissa. And she's not in this painting. Historians aren't exactly sure why, but the epic poem does mention that she is expecting another child. The storyline just didn't depict that at this point. So now the poem, as I already said, focuses in just a few, or our painting, not the whole poem, focuses in on a few things. So if we look at this very succinctly, this is taken from book 1, canto 10. And cantos, I guess, could be like chapters of a book. And then there are stanzas, which are like paragraphs. And this is taken, and I'll get there in a minute with the next slide, but I'd like to stay on this for a moment. The lines, and I'm going to read the lines very briefly, not all of them, but the artist, Benjamin West, was known to have very directly painted this based on the lines. He did not deviate very much at all from what it said in this epic poem, which is an interesting fact. So I will say just a few lines here. Lo, 2 most goodly virgins came in place, linked arm in lovely wise, with countenance demure and modest face. They numbered even steps and equal pace, of which the who's on the left is that Fidelia high, like sunny beams through from her crisp face, arrayed in lily white, and in her right hand, and you can see that it's crossed in front of her, but in her right hand bore a cup of gold, with wine and water filled to the high, in which a serpent did himself enfold. So I want to talk about her for a moment before I continue with her sister. Fidelia, that name represents faith. And as the poem designates, she is dressed in white. And here she advances down a short flight of stairs, carrying in her right hand, as the poem said, a book, and that book is the Bible, and it has gold clasps on it. And in her other hand, her left hand, she holds a chalice. That chalice is to have been or it represents the chalice of St. John the Apostle. And as legend would have it, there was an attempt to poison him, I am sure, as he drank the wine and the water from it. But a snake emerged and the snake stopped it, and therefore St. John lived. And that's the symbolism of having that in the painting. Notice, though, which is very interesting, that Fidelia shows no fear of that snake. She actually looks downward to the side, and she's radiant, as the poem designates. She has like a faint, almost a faint halo above her, and going above her to the left, not the left bottom, but the left top part of the painting is more of light that also kind of fades from her bright whiteness of her garb. Now I'm going to read a few lines about her sister. Her younger sister, that Speranza High, was clad in blue, that she beseemed well, all cheerful of sight, as was her sister, whether dread did well or anguish in her heart is hard to tell. Upon her arm a silver anchor lay, whereon she leaned over as befell, ever up to heaven she did pray. So, dissecting those lines a little bit in the painting now, Speranza represents hope. Their sister, who we do not see, the word Clarissa represents love. And these two, faith and hope. Speranza is clad, certainly we see a bluish green more, but the top part is almost a mauve color that blends down, and the mauve is deeper at the bottom. So the artist obviously took a little liberty here, moving beyond the absoluteness of the lines. But he does have the fact that she has that what is it? The anchor. I'm thinking of that word and I lost my vision here with this note. And the anchor, as we may know already, when we see an anchor often displayed, it always represents hope. So whether it originated in this poem or not, I guess we'd have to do the etymology of that and research it, but it shows hope, and that is obviously her name. Now, in the poem, it says her expression is not as luminous as her sister. And I found it interesting because I did not realize this until I read these words. The author of the poem wasn't sure why the people who dissect what he said. It says, as was her sister, whether dread did dwell or anguish in her heart is hard to tell. All we know is that she has a bad expression, perhaps more so than her sister here. And they're both looking down, but at each other. And Speranza is, she has the anchor, she's hopeful, but she's very, very pensive. And they both are, but it does appear from the lines of the poem and our interpretation of the art that they are pensive for different reasons, looking where the light and also the color depicted in Fidelia is much brighter. So now as we go to the next slide, I already said it's taken here from this poem, and it is Canto 10, as I mentioned. In Canto 10, it's those verses 12 through 14. Now, continuing here, we have an aspect of the poem of the cross night. And here we have this picture. There's a very small, hard to see element highlighted as we are here. And when you actually see the painting, you have to move up a bit closer to see this. This depicts on the very left the knight that I mentioned, and following Una, who represents truth. And they are on their way to find truth at the house of holiness. And that house of holiness is where the characters of Bedelia and Speranza come in, and their mother is the proprietor. The sisters live there too. And that is where they are headed. So, and the story continues that yes, he arrives, he finds holiness, and he wants to marry Una. But I looked up the story. Una's father said, "Oh, we want you to wait a while." And then the story progresses into other books and other adventures. And eventually he does wed her, but not in book one. It leads to that. He had to undergo some of these trials and tribulations first before that occurred. Now, what we have here, the painter, Benjamin West, if we show him for a moment here, his picture is very, he's young in this painting. He was 22 when he left Pennsylvania, spent 3 years in Rome, and then he went to England the rest of his life. But if we look at the years he lived, for that era, he lived a long time. So this is obviously a paint from his youth. I already said he was born here and, in Pennsylvania, and went to England, but he used neoclassical style, history and literature that we already said. And all of this met with warm success. He was influential internationally and welcomed many art students to his studio in England, including many American students. Now, although he remained in England for the rest of his life, his influence, as I already said, was international, and it included the New America. And here are some of the American artists that he influenced that went beyond this neoclassical era, and it went into the era of Romanticism. So researchers believe that Benjamin West was already at the prelude of Romanticism in his work. And so the artists in America that he influenced are Washington Allston, Gilbert Stuart, Charles Willson Peale, and the famous John Singleton Copley. And he influenced them for the next decades of their work, which was the 1800s or the early part of the 19th century. Now, at the outset this morning, Jerry mentioned that our artwork this morning encompassed the 16th through the 18th centuries. And each of those centuries and each of these artists had their own perspective. However, as we move to the next slide, Samantha, I'm looking at the picture here as we're looking at lots of art, not necessarily the art that we spoke of today, but what we had hoped to do, Jerry and I today, that in this pursuit of more art understanding today, we have had a very brief opportunity to become more educated, more excited, and more experienced about art. So as we move now to the last slide at the end, we would like to thank you, and I'd like to ask Jerry if she has any words to add or anything I missed that you thought of that we can close with.
I would just like to say that the art collection of the Timken is really truly outstanding. And it's a wonderful small museum in which you can really appreciate each of the works of art. You're not lost in a mass of, like at the Louvre, where you can't even begin to remember where you are in the maze of art. The art in the Timken is, for me anyway, and I think for many other people, is much easier to appreciate because it is a high quality, it's beautifully done, and the museum is an appropriate place to spend a wonderful hour or two, or even all day. It's a free museum, remember. It's the only free museum in Balboa Park. So you can go in on your lunch hour and just spend a little bit of time and work to understand and see just one or two treasures that are there. And I really encourage you to do so. It's a wonderful museum, and I'm looking forward to it being opening again. Thanks, Barbara.
You're welcome. And you know, as Jerry said also at the outset, the words educated, excited, experience come from our executive director, Megan Pope. And what I love about those 3 E's, or the 3 words that begin with E, is the fact that it's ongoing. We can never say we are educated now, and we're just as excited about any art there's ever been, or we're just completely experienced. It's such an ongoing journey. And so again, we would like to thank you for being on that journey with us, with more to come, hopefully in the future.
Thank you so much, Barb and Jerry. What a fantastic presentation today. A little virtual round of applause for the two of you. Thank you so much for presenting today. As I mentioned, if you do have any questions, please feel free to add them to the chat, but I'll just let you guys know that this tour, as well as others that we've done in the past, have been recorded and are posted on our social media, so our Facebook and our YouTube. So if you would like to check those out, please do. And our upcoming tours are also on the Timken website. So if you wanted to get any information on those, that we're still very happy to be presenting to you while the museum is still closed for renovation, please go ahead and check out the Timken website to get the information on our upcoming tours.
Thank you, Samantha.
Thank you, everyone.